So we're talking about Iran today and the killing of Major General Qassem Soleimani. First, let's just talk about who he was. I know he commanded the Quds Force, who America considers a terrorist organization. They also deemed him a terrorist. But who exactly is he in Iran's political structure?
Yeah, he has been a military hero in Iran. He has served in the military very openly and broadly and, as they would say, heroically for the last 20 years. And his role, more specifically, has been to sort of unite the region in Iran's causes. So he really leads forces outside of Iran. So attacks you might see in Saudi Arabia or in other places in the region, that's really been his role, to sort of export terror around the region. And
that's one of the things that America has talked about with him since the early 2000s, since the Iraq War started.
Right. And so he has been serving openly. So this hasn't been sort of like Osama bin Laden, where we didn't know where he was or he was sort of in hiding. He's a very public figure and very popular in Iran, and probably number 2 when it comes to power and influence.
Even though he's not doesn't hold political office.
That's right.
So the United States says that he's responsible for the killings of hundreds, if not thousands, maybe indirectly, more throughout, the last few decades.
Yes.
It's a very complicated scenario over there because you have his influence with those other countries, but he also influenced a lot of Shiite groups outside of the Iranian force that he commanded, right?
Yeah, so outside of his direct command, really what he did, and actually what he was doing when the drone strike hit him, was to coordinate with other militia groups, with heads of state, with all kinds of terrorist groups and other actors to sort of coordinate their efforts to disrupt and terrorize the region.
Now, what do you think from a foreign policy standpoint this does with our ability to try and semi-peacefully coexist with Iran?
This, I think, is where the biggest amount of concern that we're hearing today comes from, is what happens next. I don't think that there's any question that Iran will retaliate in some way. The question is how and when, but not if. And so our tensions have been rising with Iran since we pulled out of the nuclear deal and we ramped up our sanctions, which have had a devastating impact on their economy, which was the intention. But we've seen over the last month this back and forth. They have a strike, we have a strike, something happens, we do something back. And so a lot of people are concerned that this is a major escalation in that back and forth.
And going more on the political side of things now, President Trump has campaigned and promised throughout his presidency that he was going to pull people out of the Middle East. Now we're hearing that hundreds who were already scheduled to go to Kuwait, they deployed, but now 3,000 more troops are being sent to the Middle East. What do you think that does to the president and the GOP politically? And then on the flip side, what does that do to the Democrats?
I think you're right. The president did campaign on no more endless wars, and that's something we've heard from a lot of candidates and politicians on both sides of the aisle. And I think America is not interested in being involved in more decades of war in the Middle East. The president, I think his supporters and people who support this action would say he took decisive action today that was necessary and that makes us safer. And so I think if you saw the president's remarks this afternoon, he talked about this was not meant to further war, right? This is meant to make us safe and to eliminate sort of this mastermind of terror, and that this should de-escalate things in the Middle East. I think critics would voice concerns that this actually escalates things, makes the region more unstable, makes it less safe, and also makes our allies particularly vulnerable, like Israel and Saudi Arabia and other allies in the region.
And let's talk about that a little bit more, how an already very destabilized Middle East, what does that do to not only, because Iran, very influential in the Syrian conflict with supporting Assad, that's more of a 3-tier war. What happens in that region? I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here.
It's so complex. And our sort of enemies and alliances are sometimes one and the same, right?
Right.
And we see this here. And so part of what this escalation between the United States and Iran has been, it's taking place in Iraq, because we're having a struggle over who has the most influence in Iraq. And we might partner with certain people and even groups that we oppose in our fight against ISIS, but then we have a drone strike against them. You know, Iraq is worried about us infringing on their sovereignty because we are having drone strikes within their own country.
Right. A perfect example of that would be some of those Shiite quasi-military groups that Iran works with, but who also fight ISIS.
Right.
So
that's exactly
the
right.
enemy of our enemy is our friend.
Yes. It's very complicated. And so one of the risks is, how does our very tenuous alliance with some of these groups now look moving forward in our war against ISIS?
And on Twitter, World War III was trending. Do you think that this could, how high do you think this could escalate politically?
Well, so domestically, I'll loop back to what we were talking about earlier, the implications for immediate domestic politics. So we definitely saw both Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer talk about this, as well as impeachment today. So today impeachment takes a back burner, right?
Right.
But they both talked about this, one, Mitch McConnell, in terms of the president taking important decisive action to keep us safer and to fight terror. And then Chuck Schumer more questioning what was the rationale for this. So if it was, as the administration has asserted all day, defensive preemptive action to protect an imminent threat, then the administration was within their right to do that. But what members of Congress are saying is, we want to see the evidence for what sort of precipitated this threat and what your strategy is for moving forward. We're definitely seeing the Democratic candidates come out. No one's saying we shouldn't have eliminated this guy, right? He is a bad actor. He has the lives of hundreds of Americans on his hands. We have agreement over that. But I think the process is where we have some disagreement. There's long been a push and pull of where do the war powers really lie. Congress has let the president usurp those for many administrations. So yeah.
And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, you were talking about Iraq, Afghanistan as a possible retaliation location for Iran. Do you think that the fact that we killed Soleimani on Iraqi soil obviously is better than killing him on Iranian soil, right?
Well, yes, but if you look at that, we also killed an Iraqi militia leader as well. So that also does not sit very well with a lot of Iraqi public. So every one of these issues is so complex, and there's so many strings that are affected by each of these decisions. And so even domestically, we're seeing the cities of New York and Los Angeles prepare for possible threats and attacks. It is unusual for us to strike. Drone strikes aren't unusual for us, but it is unusual for us to strike a leader as high up as we've discussed, that Soleimani is in his country. And one reason we don't do that is we can see that it could potentially make our military and political leaders vulnerable to attacks. And so I think that's something we'll be preparing for too.
And last question I have for you, where do we go from here?
Oh boy. I think that we're going to see domestically, you know, you saw Senator Sanders and others come out today talking about some of their concerns. I think domestically we could possibly see another bill coming through like we did this summer, proposing to limit presidential powers when it comes to war powers. I suspected that it won't pass the Senate just like it did in the summer, but we could see some of that politically, domestically. I think right now we're seeing a real ratcheting up of our domestic and international security, our concern about our efforts to protect our allies who might be particularly vulnerable now, and our diplomats around the world who could be targets.
All right, well, Anita, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
You too.